Hello and welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for the show. And as you know, this is where we discuss those difficult topics of our day. And we do this to educate ourselves so that we can have conversations with our culture, conversations that count, conversations with an eternal perspective. For those of you who watch me on a regular basis, you know how I've been talking about how this culture has really exploded with all sorts of ideologies that are not godly. We are looking at things really as good versus evil, dark versus light. And today I have an unbelievable woman warrior on the program. And it's an honor that I even got to meet her. And now she's here to talk to us about her journey in this culture. Her name is Lisa Ekman. Some of you may have already heard about her. She's an American patriot, an author, and a farmer. Lisa worked for more than 2 decades as an advocate and lobbyist for people with disabilities in Washington, D.C. She worked for Democratic senators and a Democrat as a Democratic appointee in a federal agency. She worked with government contractors and nonprofit organizations. Once Lisa left the hustle and bustle of the District of Columbia in 2020, she began to realize she had been in a cult. Ms. Ekman sees this realization as her awakening to reality and began to deprogram herself. Thank goodness. Lisa decided to speak up about what is happening to the United States and the world to help save the country that she loves. Her first book, Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites, How I Escaped the Progressive Cult, was released in May 25, 2024, which is nearly a year ago. Lisa has a Juris Doctor cum laude from Georgetown University, a master's degree in social work from the University of Denver, and a bachelor's degree in communication and rhetoric from Northwestern University. As you can see, she is well versed to speak her mind and to also have critical thinking conversations with others. So I'd like to introduce you all to Lisa, and I look forward to our discussion. Hi, Lisa. Thanks
Hi,
for
Catherine.
being here.
It is my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me first, what do you farm?
We grow organic fruits and vegetables, and we also raise chickens for eggs.
Awesome.
And so, yeah, I do my best to eat very healthily, feed my body to keep a healthy body so that I can keep a healthy mind and a healthy spirit. We grow our own, and we contribute to the community as much as we can
I
with
think
what we
that's
grow too.
awesome. I think many of us have started realizing, hey, we don't want all of these pesticides that are causing all sorts of problems in our bodies, especially here in the United States. In fact, even wines. My daughter, one of them said, I should really look for wines that the grapes are produced outside of the United States, which then you're looking at a different price point, unfortunately. But they don't put as many pesticides, and people aren't having the problems that we have because of what unfortunately, our FDA, which I hope changes under new administration, um, that they'll stop with everything that they've been putting on our foods, our food supply. So I understand.
Yeah, and I think, some of it, unfortunately, I think is purposely done to keep us sick and to keep us unhealthy because when people are sick, then they have to focus on their health as opposed to focusing on they have to focus on their physical health, and often that means they're neglecting their spiritual and emotional health. It also means that they may not be able to pay as much attention to what the government is doing, and therefore are less of a threat to the powers that be, which I'm sure we'll talk about. more in just a minute.
Oh, I hope so. Yes, and I know that sounds like some of you out there, if you're newcomers to the program, you might be thinking, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. Well, I'll tell you what, everything that sounds like a conspiracy theory, somehow it's proven true.
Well,
I
I
think
have
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I have a saying that I say to people, and that is follow the money. And I think you have to ask two questions: who paid for it and who benefits from it? And I think when you start looking into our food supply and who spends what money on lobbying and where does the FDA get a good percentage of its budget, which is not tax dollars and things like that, you're going to come up with what is not a conspiracy, but in black and white, who is benefiting and who is paying for it. And when you take a step back and think about our what I call our sick care system in this country, because basically what most doctors do is manage symptoms once you're sick. And you ask, and you again follow the money and who's making the money. It's a very clear picture of what is going on and how our regulatory agencies that are supposed to be protecting our health have been captured by the industries that they are supposed to regulate. So, and I also would say too, not to go too deep into this, but you know, the I would ask people to look into where the term, conspiracy theories came from, and how it was developed, and what that would mean, and why it is used, and what is the difference between a conspiracy theory and a theory, just like we have in science.
Yes, so true. I always say, and now a conspiracy, as we know, is two or more people getting together to make something happen behind the scenes. Is that correct? You're the rhetoric
Oh,
person here.
yes. And sometimes it's done these days, I would say very openly, but when you see, for example, the revolving door of who heads our Food and Drug Administration, and they go straight from the board of pharmaceutical companies to the FDA, and then straight from the FDA back to the pharmaceutical company, it's not a conspiracy to say that that person is representing pharmaceutical interests when they are in our government. It again, follow the money, who benefits and who paid for it. And I think that I always consider myself a conspiracy realist as opposed to conspiracy theorist. And I think one of the things, that we can talk about and get into is also look at who is telling you it's a conspiracy theory, and where those individuals get their money. In the book, Deprogramming Democrats, I have a whole chapter on media propaganda and censorship. And one of the things you might look at is who is funding, where do most mainstream media outlets get their money? Who is advertising with them? And you will find that it is a huge percentage of their money comes from pharmaceutical companies. And this was a change made when I was a kid growing up. Pharmaceutical companies could not advertise on television, and when that changed, you might notice that there may have been some change in coverage by the media about pharmaceuticals, because if you eliminated the money that many television stations receive from pharmaceutical companies, they might not be television stations anymore. So
Right, they wouldn't have
again,
the funding.
exactly, yeah. So, and I didn't
Well,
mean to sidetrack us with that, but
no, it's
I think it's
okay because
important.
yes, it's very important. In fact, a lot of it is the key to really what is going on, and it is sick care. And I've talked about that before, and I've had some doctors on discussing it, and some nurses who were, it's just like been a nightmare for those who have awakened. And then, of course, some of us, like myself, started waking up before everything started happening in 2020 because of our own family things that have happened health-wise. And then I saw how the medical system was failing miserably and promoting, like if a doctor cannot figure out what's wrong with someone, they immediately say, well, it's in your head, which is it's unnerving, it's angering, and it's insulting, frankly.
And I think too, Catherine, I can very much relate to what you say, because part of what made me able to be ready to be woken up and to wake up in 2020, because around COVID is the time when I did wake up, but I had some interaction with our sick care system myself. Both my parents unfortunately became very ill. My dad became ill in 2009 and my mom became ill in 2013. And I'll stick to my mom's story because I think it's the most relevant. She was my dad's primary caregiver. He had spinal surgery and became quadriplegic, and so she was taking care of him, and she had multiple sclerosis. And is often the case, I later found out through research, women often get gynecologically related cancers when they are in such a situation where they are caring for a very ill child or a very ill spouse because of the stress that it puts on them. And my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 of a very aggressive uterine cancer. And was told to get her affairs in order, that she didn't have very long to live. So she came to me and she said, Lisa, I want to live and I will do whatever, is available to me in order to live. So I started, I was a researcher my whole life. I was a debater in high school and college, and that's what I did for my job. And I started doing research, and I found 2 amazing books that I would recommend to anyone to read if you are facing, or a relative is facing, cancer. And the first one is called Beating Cancer with Nutrition, and the other one is called Anti-Cancer: A New Way of Life. And they're very, data and evidence-based, scientific books, but basically what they show is that, the food that we eat, the chemicals we're exposed to, the toxicity we're exposed to in modern times contribute to cancer, and especially sugar feeds cancer. So we changed my mom's diet. We changed every product she used in her house to clean. We changed the products she put on her body. We got her to a naturopath. We had her on supplements, and she decided to do conventional cancer treatment as well. Which involved having surgery and then 1 round of chemo, which was 6 treatments. By the 3rd treatment, she was cancer-free. Praise God. She was cancer-free. The doctor could not believe it, but it was because she did all of these things to help her body heal. Now, what modern Western cancer treatment is the exact opposite of that. They poison you with the hope that they're going to poison the cancer cells, but not your healthy cells. And one of the things I learned in beating cancer with nutrition is that many cancer patients actually die of malnutrition because they do chemo and they can't actually eat. So their body has no nutrients in order to help repair itself. Flash forward 2 years from that time, my mom was cancer-free for 2 years, and she had a very small growth appear, and the doctor said, okay, we're going to give you more chemo, and the first round of chemo killed my mom. Her kidneys shut down because her kidneys could not process the platinum-based chemotherapy. And during the time that my mom, had 2 years cancer-free, she did experience some other health issues, and at one point she was in the hospital. And I said to the doctor, I'd like to bring her organic diet, her food, and he's like, it doesn't matter what she eats. It doesn't matter at all. So no. Luckily, a nurse pulled me aside and said, hey, I have a nurse's fridge. You bring it here. I'll make sure your mom gets it. And so she did. But what that told me is that the doctors are really not treating people in order to keep them healthy. And, it contradicted everything I was reading in this book. It contradicted what my mom had done to get herself healthy. Now, it did create a lot of questions for me in terms of the regulatory agencies that allowed this and the medical education system. And education is the second piece that I talk about a lot in the book. Because those are the two main ways in which people on the left have been programmed into the progressive cult, which is education and propaganda and censorship. But I worked with people at the Department of Health and Human Services, which is where the FDA and the CDC are. And so after, and my mom unfortunately died in 2016. So then I came back to DC and started working again. So I kind of had to put aside those questions in order to continue to do my job. And I did that until we flash forward to COVID. I mean, I was, in grieving for a while. Losing both your parents in such a short time is a lot to deal with. So I had just really started coming out of that grief and getting back into the swing of things. And I had decided that because there were other things that had bothered me in DC, I started to really feel like politicians on either side were not really listening to we the people. They weren't being responsive at all. I began to see how entrenched money and mattered, how much it mattered if you had money and gave money as opposed to being a constituent and expressing your concerns. And so I had decided to retire March 31st of 2020, which if you think back, I do believe that my guardian angel, my higher power was directing me that I was not supposed to be working during COVID. So I had scheduled to retire, but when the COVID lockdown started, which was right around the time I was retiring,
March 13th, I believe.
Yes, it was. So it was just a couple weeks before I retired. And, I bought everything that was going on. I was very afraid. I got my masks. I never really wore them that much. And my boyfriend at the time did not believe in what we were the narrative about COVID. And so as you might imagine, he and I were having some heated discussions about the nature of the threat, reality, what we needed to do, all of those things. I said to him, at one point, I said, I just can't believe that the people that I've worked with for 20 years, the people that I have spent hours in rooms with, debating, going through evidence, would do this to people, to do this to us, do this to the United States, do this to the world without the data and the evidence to support it. I just can't believe it. And he very calmly said to me, Lisa, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? Mm-hmm. And it sort of caused my brain to stop. Because in order to continue to work after I knew about what was going on in our healthcare, our sick care system, what I like to call the medical and pharmaceutical complex these days, I had to have this level of cognitive dissonance, which was really high. I had to believe that doctors were not working to protect people's health. At the same time, I had to believe that these federal agencies were actually trying to protect us and keep us safe. But I already knew, and since this time, the government has actually admitted that fluoride in our water poisons us. It lowers IQ of children. There are all sorts of things it does. It calcifies our pineal gland, which I believe helps connect us to the Creator and to each other. And so, and what is the most fundamental thing a human body needs? It's water. And if they're willing to poison that, why wouldn't they be willing to do anything else to us? And so the other thing that was happening at the time is that we started to see censorship of people who were raising any questions about the COVID narrative, and people who I had come to trust and understand in the natural health community, because of the research I did for my mother, and they started censoring those people. And it reminded me that I really am a First Amendment absolutist, and especially a free speech absolutist, but really the entire First Amendment, because that is what separates the United States from any other civilization that has ever existed. It is the enshrining of our God-given rights into law that the government shall not. They shall not infringe. They shall not establish. They shall not prevent. And I had been made so afraid, and that is another thing that really comes out in the book. Using fear through education and through propaganda is the main way in which people have been controlled. And when you don't have faith, and we can talk about that more later, but when you don't have faith and you're made afraid, you look for someone to make you safe. You look for someone or something to make you feel like everything's going to be okay. When you have your relationship with God, you don't need anyone else to do that for you, because He already does. But when you don't, that's how the government can get you to do just about anything to feel safe again. And so my fear had been used to control me as well. And so but the outright censorship, the not allowing people to worship when and where they pleased, which is obviously another part of the First Amendment. And then also some parts that people forget about are the First Amendment guarantees your right to assemble, and it guarantees your right to associate. So when they are saying you can't go see grandma in the hospital if she's sick and dying, but thousands of people can get together to protest, provided they are protesting an approved narrative, an approved issue, it really kind of led me to help wake up. And so after my boyfriend said that to me, and then he said, if you don't believe me, prove me wrong. Go do the research yourself, show me. And everybody sort of who was not on the left, who was not in the cult, was also saying that same thing. Meanwhile, people on the left were shutting down any attempt to find truth. And all of that put together, and he said, go prove me wrong. And I yelled, I think, fine, I will. And I started doing research for myself. And then the crack in the dam that was holding back the flood of truth burst open. And I have never looked at the world the same ever again.
What was the crack?
Well, the crack was, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? And the crack was also the censorship. It was those two things, sort of. People who censor, or the people who censor, the side who censors, the party who censors, is never on the right side of history. Truth is truth. And one of the things that the cult has tried to do, and you can see this especially when you look at, for example, the gender ideology, that thank goodness seems, and thank God, seems to be receding, and we seem to be winning that battle, although I still think we have just won we haven't won the war yet, but we have certainly are winning some battles, is to destroy objective reality. It is to destroy the meaning of words, so that you then look to some authority to tell you what the words actually mean.
It's very dystopian.
Oh,
Very.
very dystopian,
I
yes.
I remember putting up every week. I would put up a book. At that time, I would put up Animal Farm. I would put up New World Order. I would put up, 1984, just trying to hint to people. And I would like read, this week or the next 2 weeks, read this. And then I was, because I didn't have any other format or place, I was putting it up on Facebook, and they were putting, I think some of them they took down. And it's like they didn't even want people, connecting those dots. Um, so,
Yeah, and especially, I mean, I think there are a variety of them, Catherine, that apply. I think what is Jamie? That's my fiance, Sam, who was my boyfriend before. A brave new handmaid's 1984. Because they've kind of taken pieces from all of these different dystopian novels, and we are living
mhm,
through it.
mhm.
Jamie and I actually read out loud 1984 to each other during the lockdowns, and
Wow.
it was very creepy. And then I would see my former friends and colleagues on the left calling what Trump was doing Orwellian, and I just had to laugh because there was so little awareness of the fact that he's actually the opposite of that. And he believes in objective truth. He believes that there is a reality. And, you know, uh, for example, to say that a woman is a person, an adult female who was born with large gametes, eggs, that's truth. That's biological truth, and not even getting to the fact that, God created man, God created woman, and that's,
Mhm.
what there is. Um, but learning to control our language, in 1984, it's double speak.
Mhm.
That's the cognitive dissonance I was talking about. It's wrong speak. It's
Mhm.
you know when I started, I think it was in 2022, I saw there was a survey, and nearly 50% of people on the left that were surveyed thought it should be a crime to misgender someone. A crime, so that they should be able to put you in jail for calling a person who was born a man, for saying he, him. And to me, when you get to that point, you really are destroying any thought of objective reality. And I think that was also a big part of what helped wake me up. Because I started to see right before I retired, people were putting their pronouns into their email signatures, and I just really, really didn't understand it. And I think one of the other things that we started to see happening, one of the big things in 1984 is the telescreen. And what we really started to see happening is that people basically took their own telescreen. We carry it with us everywhere. We can be tracked, we can be listened to. And people, yes, I have mine right here too, and people were forced during COVID to spend, that was their only way to engage with other humans
Mhm.
for a period of time. And I think that you're yeah so people couldn't see that, though, on the left, because none of this was a topic of conversation on mainstream media or on social media in sort of left echo chambers. And I think that also started to wake me up too, is that they're so oblivious to the fact, for example, um, I also saw I started to see media rewriting history in real time. And I can give
Yes.
you some examples. that people can think about, and they're
Please.
simple ones. So, I mean, one example that I think you could look up at any and easily do a search. Although I would encourage people not to use Google, because the
Mm,
algorithms on Google are completely controlling what information you see. They are a big part of the censorship and the propaganda. But if you go back to when the vaccine, or I'm sorry, the experimental gene therapy shot that they
mhm,
mislabeled or changed the definition of a vaccine. That's one thing they did, is change what a
mhm.
vaccine is for these shots. And you look at what individuals were saying at the very beginning. Like President Biden said, if you take the shot, you will not get COVID. CDC Director Walensky was saying, you won't pass it on. You won't get COVID. You won't pass it on. Now, we know 100% that that is not true anymore. Um, and mainstream media tried to say that, no, we never said that. This was about keeping you out of the hospital and lessening the severity. But there are lots of video montages that you can find where they do go through and show that that is what they said. So that's one good example where the Ministry of Truth, as I like to call it, and that's what Orwell called it, was rewriting history to change what people believed. And if you go on into, I haven't gone there, but I'm sure if you went to
Let
Blue
me,
Sky, oh,
can
sure.
I just one, they literally during that administration called it the Ministry of Truth for a while until everyone was like, well, this is just, you keep saying this isn't like Orwellian, but look what they're doing. And
No, it really is. And, you know, if you go back, and I think you can still find some of these on the on archives.org, or the Wayback Machine, there were some headlines at the time when COVID, when they were first trying to say this came from the wet market and shutting down any discussion that it escaped from a lab. All of mainstream media was basically saying 100% it didn't come from a lab, you know, shut that down. But if you go back now, those headlines have been changed to make it seem like they never said it didn't come from a lab, just that it was more likely that it came from the wet market. There was also a story that came out before the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, saying that Russia was paying for bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, which was a complete made up lie. And now, if you go back, those headlines have been changed. So they literally are doing what Orwell said the Ministry of Truth did. You know, and if you change the present by changing the past. And so they've been, ever since the move towards political correctness started in the United States, they have been trying to control our language and control our past. And you can see that, especially when it comes to issues around racism and racial relations in the United States, as well as you can see that, as I mentioned, around the the gender ideology
yeah,
movement. So
yeah, and they started doing that early on, like 2009, 2006. In fact, no, I think it was as that's when I started to realize everything. 2005, I think, because they wanted to change the meaning of tolerance. You know, when I grew up, I was taught, and I think they were starting it even earlier, because I remember in second grade, or it might have been first, we were watching movies in class about not being prejudiced against people who didn't look like us. And I didn't see that as anything wrong. You know, some people have blue eyes, some people have brown, some people have blonde hair or brown. Okay, fine. And then there's some people that were born like with polio, or they develop polio, and they have to walk with those, with help, and don't make fun of that. And okay, fine. I also, to me, shouldn't your family be teaching you that? Why do they have to bring it into the education system? So I think even starting way back then in a very subtle way. But the tolerance thing, as an adult, I started thinking, now they're changing the meaning of that just to accommodate sexual diversity. And that's exactly what they were doing. And so they knew this is a slow progression, but it seemed to all start to really speed up between
Yeah.
2020 and 2025.
Well, I think what you saw is way back, when the time you're talking about, I mean, I think, yes, people's families should be teaching them this, right? And we're all God's children, and don't prejudge anybody. Come into every interaction you have with another human with love in your heart. And if you have love in your heart, you're not going to be prejudiced. You're not going to, that I think is what our Creator made us to be, creatures of love. But when you start making people, and you started to really see identity politics happen really in the 90s and pick up steam in the 2000s. And when we started with tolerance, with political correctness, what was the worst that would happen if you called someone a name that wasn't politically correct? People might say you're not very nice. But once we moved into the digital era, once we moved into online, where online bullying can happen, where cancellation can happen, where people's bank accounts can be frozen in a way that they couldn't, where then the consequences that would accompany these transgressions against political correctness became significantly greater. And by the time, we got to the point of the digital era, people had been made so afraid of other people through identity politics, and that's where the fear I talked about before really started to come in. I think the other thing that's important for people to understand is that many people on the left, and this happens, I'll speak mostly right now about people on the left without faith, without any connection to the Creator, because they rely on other humans to get their external validation. So, as I mentioned towards the beginning of our chat, when you have a relationship with God and you believe in the Creator, you know that the Creator has you. You feel accepted, you feel loved, you know it's all going to be okay. When you don't, you look for that from somewhere else. And sadly, many people do not get that from their families, unfortunately, and then they look to the government for it. And that is why you see you want more laws, you want more protection, you want government to keep you safe, and you get to a place where safety completely eclipses freedom in terms of what is important, and you're willing to sacrifice your own freedom, even though they don't look at it that way, for safety, because all they think about is being safe. And you will let the government do pretty horrible things to other people in order to keep you safe. And I think that's what we saw during COVID, where I have Jewish heritage. My grandfather immigrated from Poland right before World War II, and I felt, as someone who was not vaccinated, often that I might as well be wearing a yellow star.
Yes.
I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything. Again, in surveys, people on the left said that you should be able to take someone who wasn't vaccinated and put them in a camp. Literally said this.
Yes.
And so, I think, and that is what fear will do to someone. It's the same kind of thing where you dehumanize someone who is different than you, and in this case, an unvaccinated individual, because they might get you sick, even though I don't believe the science supports that, and that's a whole other story.
Right.
There's never actually any data or evidence to show that this illness could spread asymptomatically. any more than any other illness that we've ever encountered could. But putting that to the side, people believed that it did, and therefore you could be a carrier of it without actually having any symptoms. And therefore, if you wouldn't take this experimental gene therapy shot, that you should lose all your rights, basically. And one of the things that I like to point out to people is that there is no exception to the Bill of Rights for any kind of emergency. There's no public health exception to the Bill of Rights. So I would argue that you can't suspend First Amendment rights simply because there's a public health emergency, and that's what we saw happening. But I think my point being really that we really saw people being pushed into a direction of censorship and eviscerating our fundamental rights, all based on fear. And yeah, so.
And let me also say on top of that it was in the I know it was before 2015 or maybe 2016, or I'm a little rusty on my dates. I really knew all of this in the midst of everything because I was really doing a lot of research and listening to scientists, doctors, attorneys talk about all of these, about what the NIH and so what they studied well before any of this happened was what the best way to control an entire population would be. And from their research, they found that if there was an invisible enemy, and it's in the NIH archives, and if what would produce enough fear in a population to do everything that you just mentioned, turning to the government and allowing them to suspend their rights, and they would do anything. They could do anything to these people. And it was having an invisible enemy like a virus. So this was planned. They knew from experimentation, looking at what causes fear in people, to how far they could push it. And they had everything in line. They had the media on their side because they were already owned by big pharma. The government also controls what is being said. And it's not just us. And I'm sure this opened, and you can speak to this as well, opened some doors for you where you started to realize, wait, this is a global event. And all of the governments are acting the same way. And I was led to, I think it was the Rockefeller Institute that had put out Operation Lockstep. And I think they wrote that it was either, if you know it, please tell me, it was either 2011 or 2013 or even way before that. So this is a planned global takeover. And they have their politicians bought off, and in all these countries. That's why you see so much turmoil, what they call populist nationalists versus the globalists. And it is dark versus light. I mean, did you open that door as well?
Oh, of course. And I will also mention, just for people, if they've never heard of Event 201, have you? And see, again, follow the money there. Who funded it? Who benefited from it? But it was basically a dry run for all of these, all the policies that were put in place under COVID, under a pandemic. And you had Anthony Fauci saying that Donald Trump would face a pandemic, 100%.
2017.
Yes, exactly. So, so I think you definitely I definitely did see this. I definitely came to understand, we had been sold since probably, I guess, Bill Clinton, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was negotiated. We had been sold on the fact that America prospers more when we are part of a global economy. And what that basically did was completely hollow out America's ability to produce for itself. And so what basically I think we have seen from the globalists is to make our world so interconnected that we can't function without our relationships with other countries. And, people, our economy moved from a place of, obviously we went through the Industrial Revolution where we had started to get factories, and then we moved away from sort of the industry into the information revolution that we're kind of in now. So you had people like me who I produced nothing of value to anybody else except for the clients that I was working for. I mean, I like to believe that by trying to help people with disabilities, I was doing good, but at the same time, I was trying to grow the government. I was trying to make people pay more in taxes. I was trying to, the end result was making people less free. And I think what my point in bringing that up is that we now face a situation, and I'm thrilled with what President Trump is doing in terms of trying to get a manufacturing base here. But most people in the United States make nothing. They don't know how to fix anything. They don't know how to build anything. They don't grow any food. They don't contribute to anything that we need just to survive. If we got rid of, and a recovering attorney here, if we got rid of half the attorneys in this country, would that really make us a worse country in terms of being able to function? But I would tell you, if you had most of the people who live in DC, they wouldn't know how to fix anything. They wouldn't know how to build anything. I used to joke, but I think it's actually true. I don't know that they know how to make toast. They don't know how to do anything for themselves. And we were convinced that this new society would meet all of our needs and we would be fine. But the further away from the actual people being governed that governance gets, the less the needs and the wants of those people matter. And I think any kind of global government or governance that we have gets really far away from the vision of our founders here in America, and really far away of really what I think the Creator wants for us, and that is caring about our own neighbors, caring about our community, caring and building our community. So, I can care about the children in Africa, but do I really know anything about what the children in Africa need? Do I really know anything about what their lives are like? Does a politician in the U.S. really have any sense of what makes sense for someone in Africa? And I can give you an example, of what we've done through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to farmers there. So you might have had a farmer in a small African village who farmed all different kinds of crops and fed their entire village. And we go in and we say, if you want these loans, you have to become a monocrop farmer. So you have to grow corn or you have to grow soybeans, and you're going to do this so you can sell them, not to the people in your village, but so that you can make money to pay back these loans that you just took to get them.
Wow.
And this isn't good for that farmer, and many of these farmers lost their farms, and many of them sadly also committed suicide because they couldn't pay back the loans. They lost their farms. They were no longer feeding their village. So my point in this is that the more we get away from our founders' view that the real unit of governance should be the state. We often forget that all powers not specifically given to the federal government in the Constitution belong at the state. And I can tell you from living in DC that people in DC don't know what is good for your community. They will say, I know what the best interests of someone living in rural America is, but they may never have visited rural America. They might actually look down on everybody who lives there and think they know better.
I was thinking that, yeah.
And that is true. And it's sad. And I would have said the same thing myself in the past, Catherine. Why do these people vote against their own self-interest? Well, how do I know what their own self-interest is? I haven't met them. And I haven't, people make fun of people who live in trailer parks all the time in DC. And I know lots of people now who live in trailer parks. They're great people. They work really hard. And they quite literally can't afford $5 more a week in taxes to pay for a program that they'll never use. And they should have a right to do that.
Totally against.
Exactly.
That they're morally against. And that was my thing. Somebody I really care about is a Democrat, and he's like, he never thought about why should it matter, and I looked at him and I said, I don't want to pay for that. God gives me what I have, and I don't want my tax dollars taken out of my money to go to pay for someone else's abortion. And he never thought about it that way. My thinking is, let other people pay for that. If they are all for it, then go ahead. I'm not trying to stop anyone. I don't want to pay for it. And just like I don't want to pay for someone's sex change.
No, and
morally, I don't want to do that.
And I also, when it comes to both of those things, I want to make sure that if there is any question, I think when it comes to a sex change, when you're talking about what I would say mutilating someone's body, I don't want to be too strong about it, but for the book I did quite a bit of research on this topic, and I would say that it really does, it really is experimental surgery that really does not result in a functional organ. I don't want to get too gross, but
it's true. I had someone on the show last year who went all the way in the operations, and then when they finally, after everything was done except for attaching an appendage, and they've revealed to her that, hey, well, no, it's not going to be a functional. This is all,
cosmetic.
It's all make-believe. We're just going to destroy, fortunately, when people turn to God at that stage, God pulls them in and says, no, I love you anyway. This is a cruel world. And I've got you now. So, but anyway, please finish. But yeah, you're right.
Well, and that's what I was going to say, is that I think we are seeing so many young people who are so disconnected, Catherine. We're seeing the first generation of teenagers who were raised by people who had a phone in their hand most of their life, who have turned away from God, who have turned away from religion, and so they don't get the affection or the attention from their parents, and they're getting programmed in school and through media, social media. TikTok is terrible about this, by the way. And so they don't feel a sense of connection. They don't feel a sense of community, and they look for it somewhere. And they find it in these online forums. And, basically, groomers in the trans community will say, oh, all you have to do is say you were born in the wrong body, and we will love you and accept you and make you one of us. And that's why you see about 1 in 3, I think now, of people who are transitioning, detransitioning later. But
Yeah.
they may be sterile, they may be unable to breastfeed if they're a woman because of surgery, and if they've had gone all the way through bottom surgery, they may never be able to have sexual enjoyment ever again in their life. And what the truth is that we are facing a severe mental health crisis in this country with our youth.
Yeah.
So much of it is coming from this disconnection, the lack of community, the lack of faith, the lack of family. Part of what, in order to turn people away from faith and family, which basically, if you want a communist government, which they've been trying to effectuate a communist cultural revolution in our country, the two things you destroy are faith and family. Because if you have faith in your family or you have faith in God, you don't put your faith in the government, and you will not give the government power over you the way that the party needs people to have power over them to effectuate a communist government. And so instead of asking, why are so many young people rejecting something so fundamental? Why are so many young women no longer wanting to have children? The greatest gift that God gave women is the ability to create more life. Why are they no longer not only wanting to have them, but some of these young women looking at abortion as a birth control method? And why are they so disconnected from the spiritual impact that it has on them? Instead, we're told that we have to affirm these delusions that they have, instead of looking at what is really going on in the psyche of our culture, in the psyche of our country, and in the psyche of young people. And I think building community and returning to faith and returning to family is the way that we can help address it, because you can't fill a void that people have with cosmetic surgery and hormones.
It's true. Yeah, that is, wow, everything you just said is so spot on. Do you have time to stay in this, or do you have an appointment after this? I mean,
you have me. No, I'm happy to stay as long as you feel the conversation's still relevant.
Okay. Oh my God. I think I could talk to you. I have 3 sessions,
Well, as long as you think your viewers would want to watch, I'll be happy to continue to talk. So,
yes. Okay. I did want to ask you, along all of these lines, when you started to wake up during the COVID pandemic, why do you think you started to see these things, but your fellow Democrats did not?
So I think it's a couple of things. I think one, I have to give credit to Jamie, my boyfriend at the time, for very patiently asking me questions. There were times when we got heated, but someone who I respected and trusted and never tried to tell me I was wrong. And this is a big point of how you can help deprogram people who are in the progressive cult, is you're not going to convince them they're wrong by telling them facts. You're not going to convince them they're wrong by arguing with them. What you need to ask them questions. And as I mentioned earlier, he asked me the right question that just made me begin to be able to think again. And I think one of the things that I haven't mentioned that is important, and it goes back to education, which we haven't really talked too much about, and I think is really important, is that many of the people on the left, especially the most educated, and as everyone heard at the beginning, I spent a lot of time in school. I have 2 graduate degrees and a bachelor's degree. And if you think back to, even as young as kindergarten and 1st grade, what you're taught is that the teacher is always right never question authority. The teacher is always right. So the longer you're in school, the more you're educated, the more you are taught, do not ask questions. I mean, you can ask a question to understand what is the teacher saying, what does this lesson mean, but if you start to ask questions that undercut the teacher's authority or undercut what the teacher is saying, then you're going to get in trouble. You may get sent to the principal's office. You may end up in special education, or you may end up being medicated or transferred to another school. So the longer you are in school, the more you will just trust authority. And the more you are taught narratives that support authority. So when you look, I think COVID helped wake a lot of parents up, especially to what was going on in the school. There's been a concerted effort to remove any discussion of religion or faith from the classroom, even to the extent that, some children, and I myself included, might have objected to the Pledge of Allegiance, which I'm not even sure they say anymore in school, because of the fact that it says under God. And if you can't hang up the Ten Commandments in a classroom, but many classrooms with kids as young as first and second grade will have a pride flag in them, and you might have a pride flag, but you might not necessarily see an American flag. So you're sending very clear messages to children about the values that are important. BLM is important, pride is important, the American flag is not important, and any discussion of religion in the classroom would be forbidden. And so you end up with kids coming out of school, the narrative changing about, I remember in 1976 when we celebrated the bicentennial of the 200-year anniversary of the founding of the country, it did not matter if you were left, right, Republican, Democrat, religious, not religious, everybody waved an American flag. Everybody was celebrating the amazing country that we have that is unlike any other country ever established. And we talked about this, and the First Amendment being a big, big part of that. And I think that, now kids are not taught about how amazing America is. They are taught we are colonizers. They are taught we are oppressors. They are taught, that America is bad. And I will be the first to admit, and if anyone who reads my book, Deprogramming Democrats, which is available on Amazon, they will see that I do not think we are a perfect country, Catherine. I love our country. I think our leaders have done horrible things in our names, and they've kept it from us, for the most part, through propaganda and through censorship. But our country was founded on principles and with a Bill of Rights that no other country, no other civilization has ever had. But kids are not taught that anymore. So if they then go on to college, which, as we moved away from the industrial economy that we had and into the information economy, we made it seem like, and I think back when I went to college, I graduated from college in 1991. Anybody who got a bachelor's degree then probably was doing pretty well for themselves, But if you graduated with a bachelor's degree in 2010 forward to now, so many people are going to college, a bachelor's degree doesn't really get you much, especially if it's not in a field where it makes you uniquely qualified for some job. And so we convinced everyone, and especially because something like a factory job where one person, you could have a dad who worked at the factory, support a family, could own a home, have a car, go on vacation, and have a good life. That disappeared, and kids were sold on the idea that the only way you could be successful was to go to college. And so they put themselves in debt, And I'm not for getting rid of student loan debt, and that's a whole other conversation, but I do think that they were led astray in some ways to believe that a degree from any university in any major would help them get ahead. I think that a lot of kids that would not be the case for, but that's sort of a side issue. What I wanted to get to is that over 90% of professors are Democrats. Yeah. More than 90% of them give money to the Democratic Party. And that's going to vary, I do want to say, based on whatever the major is. When you get into some of the more STEM, the science and math and engineering, it's going to be a bit more even. But any of gender studies, political science, any of those are all, you're going to be heavily taught by people on the left, and not just Democrats. Often they are radical communists who believe in the deconstruction of our country and destroying all of our institutions in order to reconstruct some sort of utopian, egalitarian, communist government that never actually can exist, because it never has. It always turns into totalitarianism instead of utopia. So you have, if more than 9 out of 10 of your professors are left-leaning, they're more likely to expose you to overwhelmingly left-leaning theories, overwhelmingly left-leaning content, and you're not likely to get a really good grade if you challenge professor. And so people end up not doing that. But on top of that, as I did the research for the chapter on education, I was kind of shocked at what I found about universities. So the first thing that I found was that many universities do what they call policing of microaggressions. And I don't know if you're familiar with what a microaggression is, but I'll give you a simple example just for people who are listening. So a microaggression is something that may offend the listener, even though the person speaking it may have not had any intent to do that. And a simple one like this is, let's say you're talking to someone who's black and you ask them, "Where are you from?" Now, you might just be saying, "Are you from Chicago? Are you from Detroit? Are you from Dallas?" But they might take it as, "Oh, you're African, you're not American," or something, and then be offended by that statement.
So it doesn't even have to really happen. It's something that might happen, or they might take it a certain way. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. It is that the experience of the listener is all that matters. Your intent in what you said does not matter, whether or not objectively. Remember, we talked about getting rid of objective reality, and this is part of it. It is about discrimination and racism, or whatever ism, whether that be sexism, whether that be homophobia or transphobia, or whatever ism or phobia they're trying to accuse you of. All that matters is what happens in the mind of the listener. And so, I've had conversations with people about it and about microaggressions, and there really are, once again, it is an attempt to remove any objectivity from language and conversation. So, universities started policing microaggressions. Universities also have what are known as trigger warnings, many of them. And are you familiar with this? Let me explain a little bit, because it's crazy in some ways. So if a professor is going to teach any content that is that may be offensive or trigger trauma or upsetting, they have to let every student know about it, and a student is allowed to opt out of reading the content or learning about the content if they so choose. So what you have is a restriction on viewpoints. So you may never need to read, even when the professor assigns maybe some faith-based reading or some conservative philosopher or economist, you could opt out of it because it might trigger you. And then the final thing that really, well, two things, but a big final thing that really kind of made me say, what in the world is going on in our universities, is that there are safe spaces allowed to be created, which essentially are areas where people from what would be viewed as historically oppressed groups can exclude any non-member of the group. So you can have a black safe space, you can have a trans safe space, you can have a woman safe space, you can have a Latino safe space. I imagine that you cannot have a male safe space, and I also imagine that you cannot have a white safe space, but those would be the only two that you can't have. So, and again, meaning that young people do not ever have to be exposed to or have any experience dealing with people who believe differently than they do, and are allowed to exclude them. And then the final thing that goes on at universities is that a lot of them have what they call free speech zones. So if you have any sort of controversial position, let's say you wanted to invite Charlie Kirk to the university, for example. I'm not picking on Charlie, but he is controversial.
This happens to Christians. They try.
Oh, yeah.
They're not allowed anywhere, basically. Nobody wants to hear what a Christian has to say because it's all considered controversial. Okay.
Yeah, so if they did allow you to come to campus, they might make you go to what they call their free speech zone, which is often way off campus, or way at the edge of campus. It's small. There are times restricted. Yeah. So nobody might hear you. And, I used to joke, because I remember during George Bush's administration, I was currently obviously a Democrat then, and so I was protesting or the Gulf War at the time, and he had created what they called free speech zones, and I used to jokingly say I thought the whole United States was a free speech zone. I guess I must be wrong about that, but when you combine all of those things at universities, when you police microaggressions, when you restrict people from hearing about anyone who doesn't think like they do, and when you allow them to segregate themselves, you end up with young people who are, first of all, looking for racism, looking for homophobia, looking for ableism, looking for all the isms and the phobias in everything someone says. So that, and they have been taught that if they believe you're being racist, you're racist, regardless of what your motivation was, regardless of whether objectively anybody might look at what you said and believe that you're racist, that their lived experience, and you may hear this, and this is part of critical race theory, their lived experience is all that matters. So if they believe that you're racist, you're racist. And they don't have to justify it, they don't have to put it through, and again, there's no objective reality, and this is, what gets back to that. So these young people also, believe, since they're able to restrict you from coming into their safe space, they're able to restrict you from speaking freely, they get used to the restriction on people's rights. And as long as it isn't their own rights that are being restricted, they're fine with it. And that's, what you see coming out of universities these days.
Well, and this steps right into what you were saying about during the lockdowns and then they mandated experimental gene therapy shots, that it didn't matter what, these people, what your rights are. It's like my body, my choice went out the window.
Well, and it did. And one of the things that I also talk about in the book, there's a chapter on what makes people more susceptible to the brainwashing and the programming. and the ability to have a high level of cognitive dissonance, to hold ideas that really can't fit together, I think is a characteristic I find in a lot of people on the left. And so, yeah, my body, my choice, except for your body, my choice, when what your choice is might hurt me. And again, it goes back to getting someone scared enough that you promise them safety. They're willing to do whatever is necessary, and they won't even notice that it seems inconsistent with any other position that they're taking. And I think the other thing that I think is really important to understand about what has happened to educated people, why so many of them end up being members of this progressive cult, is that you are taught in the university that if you don't get a university education, then you can't be an expert in whatever field it is that you're studying or you're asking questions about. And so they create kind of a monopoly on knowledge by saying only someone with this degree is an expert in this topic. And that's why you'll see so many people on the left, maybe on social media, saying, oh, well, what's your credentials? What's your background? And if you don't have it, they will not even entertain thinking about what it is you've had to say. So on top of the degree, then often they require you to go to the government and get the official government credentials. So the license, the admission to the bar, the certification. And so what also happens is when you graduate, you are now an expert in whatever topic you were majored in, or you got your advanced degree in, and you know better. And this is where you see people thinking like they know better than everybody else because they're told that they do. You studied this at university, you know better. And so I'm not going to listen to anybody who, despite they may have seen it with their own eyes, they may have heard it with their own ears, may have felt it with their own hands, I won't listen to them if they don't have the degrees and the credentials. And so go ahead.
No, I'm going to get back to the cognitive dissonance, but I want you to finish what you're saying.
Okay, yeah. So I think, people sometimes when I say it's a cult, they're like, well, there's no, charismatic leader of this cult. But there is. They worship authority and they idolize the expert. And someone like Anthony Fauci is their false idol, and they idolize him. And so if he said it, it's like it came from, it is like a religion, it is like a false, a leap of faith. And if they said it, and then of course everyone in the mainstream media echoes it, and then the fact checkers, which once again follow the money, all of those fact checkers are paid by our government. I think that has all come out both through the Twitter files, but if you're interested in really doing a deep dive on that, I recommend a man named Mike Benz. He has done some amazing work there. But if
we're talking about Reuters, all of them are
all of them.
In fact, the government was very open, even during the last administration. They had to admit that they had a connection with them. And of course they're funding them. So, because that has been thrown in my face when I mentioned bioweapons. And it's like, oh, that's not true. The AP says so in Reuters. And I'm like, oh my, you have no, it's like, you have been hoodwinked and you're fighting for that and you don't even realize. So.
Well, and that is true, Catherine. We'll get back to cognitive dissonance in a second, but the other thing I want to say there is that I think one of the things that's important to remember is that the people on the left who are hoodwinked that way are not dumb. They're not stupid. No. And in fact, they are programmed and brainwashed, and it is in fact easier in some ways to control someone who is smart but lacks faith, lacks sort of that grounding that faith and your relationship with the Creator gives you. It is much easier to program and brainwash them, because everybody wants to be connected to something. Everyone wants to believe they are part of something bigger. And if they don't have the faith in God, and the government comes and says, I can be your God, essentially, they put their faith there. And also they have been told over and over again, part of what happens with indoctrination is repetition, with a repetition, restriction of opposing views, but a reward and punishment system. And that's what grades are. And a lot of these people have been told over and over again how smart they are, and that's why you're doing so good in school, and that's why you're getting all of these awards, and this is why you're in honors classes. And so that reward system working has been to tell them how smart they are, but it shuts down critical thinking, and it shuts down asking questions. And that's why it seems like they're not thinking for themselves, because they actually aren't. They're parroting what the experts that they idolize tell them over and over again everywhere they look. Just one point also for people who are watching, listening. If you are really new to what has gone on with media, I recommend starting with taking a look at Operation Mockingbird and the hearings held. What are the name of the hearings?
Was it the Snoop
The church.
hearing? Okay, the church hearings.
I think so. I think it was. But Operation Mockingbird, even on Google, you can find out about this. But since the 1950s, our government has been having relationships with the media and controlling the media and script writing in Hollywood and everything else. Take a look at Operation Mockingbird and start there. Because that's not a conspiracy theory. That is a conspiracy that has been fully documented and investigated by Congress. And again, Mike Benz, B-E-N-Z, he does a deep dive into all of this. But I would start with just looking at Operation Mockingbird. So, the hardest thing to admit is that you've been fooled. And
it was the church committee hearings. That's what it was. And I was thinking Snoops because of the Snoops fact checkers.
Oh, Snopes, yeah.
Snopes, okay.
They're a perfect example. And I did, look at them before I woke up. They are a perfect example of using what I mentioned at the beginning of following the money. Look at who funds them, look at who runs them, and look at who benefits from them. And Media Matters is another one that you can, I'm ashamed to admit that I worked very closely with them to help debunk things when I was a Democratic disability lobbyist. But look at who funds them, and you'll see a story that is very different.
I was like, okay, who runs it? That was my first thing. I would find that. And okay, where did they go to school? And the Snopes people went to Berkeley. And so that even added to my prejudice against them. And I didn't, at that point, I was like, I didn't go further, like who is funding them. I do now, I go further. It's like, is funding this operation? Because you have to, like NGOs too. Is everything okay?
You froze, but I don't know if it was me or you but everything's fine now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyhow, I know we are almost getting to an hour and a half, which I could go on for a long time, but this is the cognitive dissonance. You mentioned, unless you're grounded in faith, and I agree with that, but I know Christians. And when someone, when shut me down, when I mentioned something about bioweapons, it happened in church with a church person who actually is a paid to work at the church. So, these are people who are running things in the church. And I knew Christians who ran out and got these experimental, bioweapons, basically, is what we know they are. And they ran out. I mean, they can get scared too, and they can get very wrapped up in the authoritative dogma that goes on, and not even realize, why are you worshiping that? Why are you not thinking? So what, I know, what was it about you? You explained what was about you, that you could walk away from the Democrat Party. I've heard Naomi Wolf talk about the same thing, talk about somebody who, she, political analyst, I think that's her Yale background. Just big people just realizing this is wrong, what's happening here. So where do you draw that line? What do you think from your experience, other than grounded in God? And yes, what happens to people who are supposedly grounded in God?
I mean, I think that is a tougher one for me to answer, Catherine, because that's not my own personal experience.
Okay.
I think that my suggestion for anybody, whether grounded in God, whether they have faith or not, is that the better you know someone, the better you might be able to help them wake up. They have to do it themselves, but if you're trying to wake someone up, the best way to go about it is the Socratic method, and to ask questions. To ask them questions. What do they care about? What do you know that they care about? If they are a person of faith, what do you know about how their faith manifests in them? What matters to them? Where do you see the cognitive dissonance between the position that they're taking and the faith that they have? And how can you ask a question that helps them to think about that cognitive dissonance? The questions that you ask can't presuppose an answer, and they can't include facts, because we don't live in a reality of the same facts with people who are members of the cult. Even if they are religious, even if they have faith, they may still be members of the cult. But so, for example, with what you're talking about in terms of the bioweapon, the experimental gene therapy, asking something about how they see that fitting with their faith, or about that one is a tough one, I think, because that one is a tough one, because they really did make everyone really, really afraid of COVID. They had it, counters on everywhere you looked, how many people were sick, how many people were dying, to make people really, really afraid. But asking questions that sort of put together the how can the person hold that view, but also believe that God has them. I think that a lot of people, maybe of faith, were convinced that if they didn't get the shot, they were going to hurt somebody else, because that was a lot of what they sold people on. Well, you could kill grandma and not even know you were sick.
The compassion.
And that is a point that I didn't make, but most people on the left and in the cult are extremely compassionate, but that compassion has been manipulated through fear into anger, so that people are, they are angry, and that it doesn't look very compassionate. If you look at like all these trans activists, or people who are allies of trans people, they don't seem very compassionate when they yell at you. But it is really compassion that's twisted. Yes, exactly. But so here's what I might, recommend in a situation like that, is to think about questions like this. I'm really interested in how you came to your conclusions about this shot. Could you point me to the study that shows that it's safe? Could you point me to the study that you looked at that convinced you that it's effective? Could you point me to the study X, Y, and Z? And asking these kind of questions, it doesn't necessarily, what it does is a few things. First of all, is it stops you from looking like you're trying to tell them they're wrong, right? You're trying to understand them. You're trying to understand where they are coming from. And if they're relying on that external validation that we talked about, you're putting them in the position of, I value you, I value your opinion, and you're also kind of making it seem like they're the expert and you're asking them. But what you're really doing is pointing them into a direction, perhaps if they're ready for it, if they're open to it, they might go, you know what, I don't know that I've ever looked at a study. Or you know what, I can't do that because I don't have any data to share with you. And it might cause them to start trying to think about it themselves. What you have to be prepared for, even when you ask a very simple question like that, is they may react very violently because and strongly, because the subconscious mind of that person will know that if it's like a thread on a sweater, if you pull it, the entire sweater falls apart. If you get through to them on any issue, their entire reality may crumble. That's what happened to me. And so the subconscious will do everything it can to protect the delusion that they are living in. And so, first of all, don't take it personally, because it's not personal, and know that they're just lashing out. And the second thing is that you have now planted a seed, and that seed is not likely to germinate during your conversation with them, but it may germinate afterwards. And they may end that conversation, they might call you a bad name, or hopefully if they're Christian they don't, but we know that they still might call you a bad name. But then an hour later they might go, you know what, I don't know, why do I believe that? Why do I think that? Where did I get that information? And that seed may germinate and into a very beautiful change in their ability to think for themselves. But it's not easy. Every person, the question's going to be different, and you'd have to think about, the more you know the person, the better you can think about what question might work or what they really care about. Although when you're really, really close to that individual, it can be very, very challenging. I sadly have been talking to a lot of parents whose children, after they voted for Trump in this last election, have disowned them or cut their family off because they won't affirm whatever gender identity or those kind of things. And sometimes very, very close, it's really hard. But once again, you can't try to tell them anything. And I think that's the hard part. Because you'll hear people all the time saying, they won't listen to facts, they're just emotional, they don't care about data. And the truth is that if it didn't come from an approved source and an expert that they trust based on their programming and brainwashing, they won't hear it at all. And so that is true. And the question is, how can you frame a question that might allow them to actually think for themselves and start asking questions themselves again?
Well, there is so much there. And one last thing, you do mention that you realized it's a cult. And I have to ask, do you face backlash from the people that you used to know and work with, from the Democrats, from walking away and pointing these things out? Have you received any threats or just ugly words?
I have definitely received a few ugly words, no threats. I think one of the things that was kind of nice about the timing of my retirement, Catherine, is that there was nothing I could be canceled from. There was nothing that I could be, you know, and so, you know, I moved out of DC. I moved to the farm in the fall of 2020, pretty soon after I woke up, and I didn't no longer needed a job. I have lost most of my friends, my former friends. I don't really talk to many of my former colleagues at all. And, you know, there's quite a few members of my family that, not that I've had a falling out with, I just don't really have a relationship with because of you know, I think there are people with whom at this point that it is not going to be very possible to help them wake up unless you can sense the opportunity. And I try my best not to bang my head against the wall or create antagonism where none needs to exist, you know. So there's a lot of my family that I just don't talk to at this point and lost most of my friends. Like I said, I couldn't be canceled from anything, so I think if there was an ability to cancel me, I probably would have been canceled. I certainly can't go back and work with them anymore, that's for sure.
Right. And like you said, it's happening on both sides because many, that's what we call rhinos, is they think it's a uniparty. You know, they think just like the Democrats. And so really it's a uniparty. If you want to know more about Marxism and communism, how do you get there from a free country? You know, there are stages that you have to go through, so that it's kind of like everyone's talked about it, boiling a frog in water. It's slow, and we're at a point now where we have that small window of opportunity to really mess up a lot of the things that they've been working on for over 100 years to destroy this country. But it takes all hands on deck, and your book is a beautiful testament to that. And I know writing things, it takes time, and you want to have references because you will be questioned about what you're saying.
You definitely will. And, you know, I just want to echo that. I think that the biggest thing that we can do is speak our truth, speak the truth, not be afraid that you're going to get judged, you're going to get canceled, you're going to get those things, because with something like gender ideology, the reason it got so far is we wanted to be nice in the beginning and we didn't speak the truth. I don't care how an adult dresses. I don't care who an adult loves. I don't care what chemicals an adult puts on their body, what cosmetic surgery they have. As long as they don't try to control my speech, my belief, or mess with our children. And they crossed all those boundaries, but they did it slowly. Now it's important that I do not feel any doubt or anything when I say a man is a man and a woman is a woman. And we have to be willing to be brave and strong and say those things, because I think I mentioned this to you offline before we started, but you know, we're very fortunate that, you know, God helped Donald Trump make it into office, and we all helped him make it into office. But he can't run again, and in 2028 he will no longer be our president, and we need to ensure that we don't go right back to where we were headed before he came into office. He's doing amazing things, but as you all know, it's all through executive order pretty much, which can be immediately overturned when the next president comes into office, just like President Biden did to President Trump's executive orders from the first administration, and just like President Trump has done to a lot of Biden's executive orders from his presidency. So we have won a battle, but the war for our souls, and truth is not won yet. So we need to keep fighting.
Good. Well said. Great way to end this. I want to put your book up one more time and let people know where they can get it.
Sure, you can get it on Amazon and you can get it on Barnes and Noble. You can also check out my website, which is scrolling at the bottom, deprogrammingdemocrats.com, and I am deprogrammed them on X.
Perfect. Perfect. So everyone, please check that out. Read it. Learn from it so that you can help those that you love get out of it. Because Matthias Desmet, who is a clinical psychologist out of Belgium, wrote, what was it? Something of tyranny, that the programming of tyranny or something like that. And he said that 25 to 30% of people who have been brainwashed will never come out of it. And that might be who you were talking about in your family, that are so far along. I have that too in my family. But there are still some open doors for some, because there's this 40% in the middle that can be turned around to have their eyes open. So there's still hope, and God is good, and He doesn't want anybody hating. And there seems to be a whole lot of hate, really coming from one side of the aisle. Unfortunately, it's sad. So anyway, thank you so much, Lisa. I feel like I would love to have this chat again, and I know you have so much to say with your experience, but I'm just grateful that God guided you, started getting you out of the system. It seems like perfect timing, and that means that God's hand was in it, waking you up and making you uncomfortable with what you were seeing. So thank you, and God be with you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for this conversation, and God be with you as well.
Thank you. I'm so happy we met.
Me too.